The feed from the planet's surface filled the main display of my husk. The Attaché-class executive interface is less a tablet and more a concrete slab of processing power, a briefcase-sized device that serves as the single point of control for every quantifiable system on Habitat Prime. From my command chair, I could monitor the life signs of all 112 crew members, track every watt of power consumed, and route every kilobyte of data. My job title is Executive Director of Off-World Assets for the Interstellar Consortium, the corporate state entity that owns this station and this mission. My actual function is to sit here and ensure the numbers on this device balance in favor of the consortium. Dr. Alistair Finch's voice was the audio track to the video, a smooth, confident baritone that knew how to sell a narrative. Finch was the mission's lead behavioral psychologist and the architect of its core premise. I privately designated him the mission's original sin. His entire career was built on the empathic resonance model, a theory which held that empathy was a universal constant, a law of consciousness as fundamental as gravity. He believed that with the right approach, humanity could forge a bond with any sentient species, a connection that bypassed language and technology. Hope, on my ledger, is always logged as a liability. On the screen, one of Finch's team members, a young xenobotanist named Shaw, was displaying a controlled grief response. Her shoulders were slumped, her head bowed. Facing her, a pantomime copied the posture with unnerving precision. The beings were the reason we were here, orbiting the planet we had designated Xyos. The pantomime stood just over 2 meters tall, a figure of seamless off-white material like unpolished alabaster. Its head was a smooth ovoid, absent of a mouth or nose, featuring only 2 circular indentations filled with discs of a black material. They were not eyes. They were biological lenses. Shaw looked up slowly, eyes glassy, lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. The pantomime's blank face reacted. A seam appeared from nowhere, pulling back into a perfect representation of a downturned mouth. The black discs widened, mimicking dilated pupils. The replication was flawless. "You see?" Finch's voice resonated with the warmth of a prophet whose miracle had just manifested on schedule. "This is not simple mimicry. This is shared experience. They are feeling with her. True resonance." The other scientists in the command center murmured their agreement. I saw nods. On my husk's secondary screen, the bio-leasing dashboard showed a cascade of green lights. This system translates the real-time biometrics of every crew member into a simple color code of operational readiness. Green is optimal. Yellow is a warning. Red is a failure state. Dr. Finch's words were a powerful tranquilizer. The cortisol levels across the station dipped in unison. The board, the 12-member committee of investors and strategists who run the consortium from Earth, would see this report and classify the mission as a staggering success. Finch saw connection. I saw a perfect mirror, and a mirror by its nature is a non-performing asset. It reflects, but it does not create. It shows you what you already have. For 3 weeks, the pantomimes had been an astonishingly efficient data sponge, absorbing and replicating every gesture, vocal tonality, and emotional display we presented. But they had offered nothing original. No new technology, no new language, no new concepts. The project was producing terabytes of redundant information, a massive cost overrun in terms of data storage for zero net gain in proprietary knowledge. My jaw tightened, a familiar muscular reflex to suppress an unproductive verbal response. I registered the sensation with the same detachment I would an amber warning light on a systems panel. Finch's brand of conviction was a known operational hazard. It was the same kind of belief that had killed 42 miners under my watch 20 years ago on the Hyperion moon. Their project lead, a charismatic man who trusted his gut over the seismic sensors, had pushed them toward a production record. I had been the junior logistics manager who filed the formal report predicting the collapse. It was dismissed as pessimism. I watched the life support icons for those 42 men go dark on my screen, one by one. That event codified my entire management philosophy. Idealism is a weapon of mass destruction. Systems and data are the only things that prevent attritional loss. Finch concluded his presentation to a wave of quiet applause. He was smiling, a man vindicated. He had delivered on his promise. He had found a soul in the void. I looked down at the husk. 112 green lights. Mission parameters met. Stakeholders satisfied. The project was on schedule, and for the moment, under budget. But the balance sheet felt wrong. The numbers added up, but the asset felt hollow. The operational day cycle wound down. On the main display, the feed from Xyos switched to an automated sensor sweep of the landing zone, designated the Calm. My eyes swept over the bio-leasing dashboard, a sea of steady green. An efficient system is a quiet system. The door to my command center opened with a soft release of pressure. Vance stepped inside. He was the head of security, which meant he was the primary risk mitigation asset for all physical threats. Vance was shaped like a bunker, broad, blunt, and unyielding, as if grown under pressure instead of born. "Director," he said. His voice was gravel dragged over concrete. "Kalen, report." "No incidents. The science teams are secure in the surface habitat. The perimeter sensors are clean." He stood before my desk, hands clasped behind his back. A textbook posture of subordinate respect. "I have reservations about Dr. Finch's protocols. He's allowing his teams too much unstructured contact. Familiarity introduces variables." "Your reservations are logged," I said, not looking up from the husk. "Dr. Finch is delivering on the mission's primary objective. The board is pleased with his progress." "The board isn't here," Vance countered. "Sentiment is a poor substitute for security." His logic was sound. He was a good asset, reliable and predictable. Then he did something that was not on his data sheet. He shifted his weight, and as he spoke his next sentence, he made a small, dismissive gesture with his right hand, a flick of his first 3 fingers. It was an insignificant movement, almost a conversational punctuation mark, but it was not his. I had seen that exact gesture 100 times. It belonged to Alastair Finch. Vance despised Finch and everything he stood for. My own hand stopped its movement over the husk's interface. I looked up at Vance's face. He seemed unaware of what his hand had just done. The motion was a piece of code that had been uploaded into the wrong machine, an error in the human firmware. "Is there anything else, Kalen?" "No, Director." He gave a short nod, turned, and exited. I watched the door close. I logged the event in my private directory. Vance K. Behavioral inconsistency noted, 1800 hours station time, cross-reference with stress indicators. It was a minor data point, likely a symptom of prolonged proximity, an inefficiency of human social dynamics. I dismissed it and turned back to the real system, the one made of code and conduits. I initiated the end-of-cycle data sync, pulling the archived biometrics from the last 24 hours into a single file for upload to the consortium Ansible. The Ansible was our link to Earth, a communications device that folded space-time to send information faster than light, though it still came with a punishing 18-minute delay each way. The progress bar on my husk filled. The process was routine, a simple aggregation of logged data. Then a flag appeared, a small amber icon, data integrity anomaly. I opened the error file. The system was flagging the biometric logs of 2 crew members. Subject 1, Dr. Eamon Bell, the mission's lead ethicist, located in his office in Module Beta. Subject 2, a junior hydroponics technician named Tobin Shaw, currently on the surface of Xylos, a full 100 kilometers away. The anomaly was in their sleep cycle data from the previous rest period. Their circadian rhythms, the complex, unique patterns of deep sleep, light sleep, and REM had synced. not just fallen into a similar pattern, but synced with a statistical deviation of 0.001%. An impossibility. Two separate biological systems, isolated by vacuum and distance, cannot spontaneously align their most complex autonomic functions with that degree of precision. It was a ghost in the machine, a corruption in the data stream. My fingers moved across the interface, pulling up the raw feeds from their individual bio-leasing monitors. The data was consistent. The error was not in the final aggregation, it was in the source code of reality itself. A knot of acid formed in my gut, a familiar indicator of an unscheduled timeline deviation. This was not a personnel problem. This was a systems failure. The station's central operating AI, CENTCOM, was responsible for all data collation. This phantom sync was a bug in its code. I keyed in the command string, routing a full Level 1 diagnostic to CENTCOM's core programming. The text appeared on my screen. Initiate system integrity protocol. Search for data corruption in all biometric logging channels. Report origin. Let the system find the bug. That was the only way forward. You don't fix a man's quirks. You debug the machine that measures them. The diagnostic completed 3 hours later. My eyes had not left the husk. Rerouting power, monitoring atmospheric filtration cycles, approving resource dockets. The station's quiet rhythm was a constant I could anchor to while the subroutine ran. The alert chimed, a single note. The results populated the screen. Diagnostic complete, systems optimal, no data corruption detected. The synthesized baritone of CENTCOM, the station's operating system, followed a half-second later through the speaker. Systems optimal. No data corruption detected. I ran the diagnostic again. A pointless exercise. CENTCOM does not make errors of this magnitude. It simply executes its function. The second result was identical. The data was valid. The system that governed every circuit and sensor on Habitat Prime was telling me that two separate human beings had achieved a biological synchronicity that violated fundamental principles of science. The problem was not in the machine. This was no longer a maintenance issue. It was an unmanaged variable. A klaxon sounded, a sharp, insistent alarm. An amber alert flashed on the husk's display. Proximity violation, Sector 7G Xylos surface. I routed the main feed to the helmet camera of Tobin Shaw, the hydroponics tech whose data was part of the anomaly. The image on the main screen was a jumble of motion, the rust-colored soil of Xylos swinging wildly. Her breathing was a ragged staccato over the comm. "Stabilize feed," I commanded. The image steadied, focused. The science team was gathered near a piece of equipment, a standard automated cargo sled used for transporting geological samples. It was a flat, floating pallet guided by low-power repulsors. One of its directional thrusters was sparking erratically. 50 meters away, Shaw was on her knees, her hands covering her helmet as if she could block out the sight. Between her and the sled was the cause of the alarm. One of the pantomimes was down. The sled had clearly malfunctioned, veering off course and striking it. Its left arm, severed cleanly at the shoulder, lay on the ground. The rest of its body was frozen in a half-fallen posture, a still life of an accident in progress. As I watched, the severed arm began to move. Its fingers, lying inert in the dust, started to tap, a slow, steady rhythm. I cross-referenced the video log. It was the same rhythm Shaw had been tapping against her leg not 5 minutes earlier while waiting for a soil analysis to complete. The arm was a peripheral device stuck in a command loop. "Shaw, report," I said, my voice cutting through the open channel. Her choked sob was the only answer. Dr. Finch's voice came next, thin and strained. "Director, it's arm. It's not bleeding." On the screen, the body of the pantomime began to change. It was a controlled, systematic process. The seam that had formed its mouth smoothed over and disappeared. The two black discs of its eyes filmed over, turning the same dull, off-white as the rest of its head. In the space of 10 seconds, every feature it had mimicked was erased, leaving only a blank, featureless ovoid. It was a factory reset. Then it began to slump. It did not fall like a body, but sagged like a sculpture made of warm wax. The rigid lines of its limbs softened, folding in on themselves. The sound coming through Shaw's microphone was not the tearing of flesh or the snapping of bone. It was a high-pitched whisper, like sand trickling inside a ceramic vase. The entire form settled into a shapeless, lumpy mound on the ground. The science team was silent. The only sound was Shaw's breathing and the crackle of the damaged sled. I opened a new incident report. Designation, Asset Degradation Event. Time, 1942, Station Standard. Asset Unit, Pantomime 2. Cause, catastrophic structural failure due to impact from malfunctioning cargo sled, Model 4B. Result, total loss of asset. The biomimetic sync was no longer a mystery. The two subjects, Bell and Shaw, were not the source of the anomaly. They were the receivers. The pantomimes were the transmitters. This entire time, we had been logging the vital signs of the operators, not the puppets. The knot of acid in my stomach dissolved, replaced by a sharp clarity. The frustration of a manager who has been staring at the wrong problem. Finch's search for a soul was a waste of resources. Our partners were not a species to be understood. They were a technology to be reverse-engineered, and one of them had just shown us its shutdown protocol. The dust settled on Xyos. The team on the surface moved with the careful, hesitant steps of people at the site of a fatal accident. My screen showed Tobin Shaw being led away by another scientist, her body shaking. Dr. Finch's voice returned to the comm, no longer strained but fortified with a fresh layer of intellectual justification. He was rebuilding his conceptual framework around the new inconvenient data point. "Director, we must give them space," Finch said. "We've just witnessed something profound, not a death, but a transformation, a shedding of form. To treat this as a simple mechanical failure would be a catastrophic misinterpretation." "The mission's exobiologist is Dr. Silas Croft," I stated. I toggled Croft's private channel. "Dr. Croft, what is your assessment of the residual material?" Croft's voice was a welcome change, dry and precise. "Director, from visual observation alone, it appears to be a form of desiccated fibrous silicate, chalky, brittle. I see no evidence of cellular decay, no enzymatic activity, no necrosis. It's clean. I can't offer more without a sample." "Then take one," I said. A pause. Then Finch cut back in. "That is a violation of First Contact Protocol, Section 4. We cannot interfere with their funerary rites." "There is no data to support the conclusion of a rite, Dr. Finch," I said, my fingers documenting the exchange on the husk. "There is only data supporting a state change from functional to inert. Dr. Croft requires a sample for analysis. That is his function." "To desecrate their remains?" Finch's voice rose. "That is an act of aggression. It will set us back months, perhaps permanently poison this fragile trust we've built." The acid returned to my stomach, a symptom of a workflow bottleneck. Finch was no longer a scientist. He was a non-compliant stakeholder protecting a non-existent asset. "Dr. Croft," I said, ignoring Finch, "what is your professional opinion on the likelihood of the residue providing a complete picture of the asset's operational state?" Another pause, this one shorter. Croft was a man who respected data, not sentiment. "Unlikely, Director. The degradation process appears total. The complex structures are gone. It would be like trying to understand a processor by analyzing a pile of sand. To understand how it works, I would need a sample from a functioning unit. That was the critical path forward, the variable I needed to quantify." "Negative." Finch's voice was nearly a shout. "Absolutely not. I will not authorize an invasive procedure on a living sentient being. It is unethical. It is monstrous. I will file a formal objection with the board." "Your objection is noted, Doctor," I said. The dull ache in my temple began to recede, replaced by the clean feeling of a decision solidifying. I opened the mission charter on the husk, found my authorization codes and keyed in a new directive. Mission parameter reclassification. Effective immediately. Primary objective shifted from diplomatic engagement to technological assessment. Protocols governing asset interaction are now superseded by Directive 7B. Threat analysis and intelligence gathering. Dr. Finch, I said, my voice leaving no room for debate. Your first contact protocols are hereby suspended. Your authority over surface operations is rescinded and has been transferred to Vance. The pantomimes are no longer to be considered a diplomatic entity. They are a potential surveillance technology of unknown origin and capability. A dead silence fell over the comms. Finch was likely speechless, his entire reality inverted by a single command string. I turned my attention to Croft. Doctor, you have your authorization. You will need a clean sample. The device you carry, the somatic probe, it has two modes, the passive resonance scan and the invasive tissue sampler. Yes, Director. Croft's voice was quiet, stripped of any emotion. He was a good scientist. He followed the data. You will approach the next pantomime you encounter, I ordered. You will engage it, and when its attention is fixed, you will switch the probe to invasive mode and extract a core sample. I leaned back in my chair, my hand resting on the cool metal of the husk. The decision was made. The costs were logged. We had spent weeks trying to talk to a mirror. It was time to find out who was on the other side of the glass. The silence on the comm channel was a vacuum, a brief suspension of operational flow. On the main screen of my husk, Dr. Croft stood frozen for a moment, the somatic probe held loosely in his hand. He was a system waiting for final confirmation before executing a high-risk command. Finch's voice broke the silence, no longer shouting, but low and pleading, directed entirely at Croft. Silas, don't. Think about what you're doing. This is the moment history will judge us for. It's the difference between being explorers and being conquistadors. On my bio-leasing dashboard, Finch's icon was glowing a solid red. A failure state. His cortisol levels were off the chart. He was no longer a mission lead. He was a compromised asset actively disrupting a critical procedure. On the screen, Finch stepped directly into Croft's path, placing himself between the scientist and the nearest pantomime. The alien construct, standing a few meters away, mirrored Finch's protective stance. It assumed the same protective posture, a mockery of defiance sculpted in alien flesh. It was a beautiful, infuriatingly meaningless piece of mimicry. "Kalen," I said, my voice cutting cleanly into the channel. "Director," Vance's voice answered instantly. "Ensure Dr. Croft has a clear path to the asset. The doctor is interfering with a direct order. Enforce compliance." There was no hesitation. Vance and his single security officer moved forward. Finch held up his hands. "You can't do this, Kalen. On my authority as lead psychologist," Vance did not engage him verbally. He simply took Finch by the arm. His steps were measured and quiet, like someone trained to remove threats without raising alarms. It was the physical equivalent of revoking a user's permissions. The security officer took Finch's other arm, and together they escorted him to the perimeter of the work zone. Finch did not struggle. He just slumped, a man whose entire belief system had been deauthorized. With the obstruction removed, Croft looked toward his objective. The pantomime was still holding its defensive posture, a ghost of Finch's now absent protest. Croft took a slow breath. His own icon on my dashboard was yellow but steady, a system under strain, but performing within acceptable parameters. He approached the pantomime. It watched him, its blank head tracking his movement. It did not retreat. Croft raised the somatic probe, a silver rod glinting in the alien light. "Engaging passive scan now," Croft reported. A blue light flashed from the tip of the probe. He held it a few centimeters from the pantomime's torso. The creature remained still, a statue being appraised. "I am now switching to invasive mode," Croft said. A panel on the side of the probe slid back with a click. From the tip, a needle, thin as a hair and catching the light, extended less than a centimetre. Croft's hand was steady. He pressed the needle against the pantomime's smooth, off-white skin. There was no reaction, no flinch, no sound, no change in posture. The needle sank into the material with a faint resistance, like pushing a pin into dense clay. Croft held it there for 3 seconds. A small light on the probe blinked green. He withdrew it. The tiny puncture mark on the pantomime's surface remained for a moment, a perfect circle, before it slowly smoothed over and vanished, leaving the skin seamless once more. The creature had not felt a thing. A data packet arrived at my husk, a direct feed from the probe. The analysis was instantaneous. I watched the lines of code scroll across my screen. Not a genetic sequence, not a breakdown of amino acids or cellular structures. It was a materials list. Analysis: complex polymer chain, non-organic, silicon-carbon base, trace elements, tungsten, platinum, no RNA, DNA detected, no cellular structure detected, no biological markers detected. The proof was absolute, undeniable. I looked up from the husk at the main screen. The pantomime stood there, impassive. It slowly lowered its arms, mirroring Croft, who had just lowered the probe. It was a machine. A flawless, beautiful, advanced machine. A tool. The implications flooded my mind, a cascade of new strategic variables. This was not first contact. It had never been first contact. This was industrial espionage on a scale we could not comprehend. We had willingly invited a competitor's surveillance drones into our most sensitive operations. The rage I felt was not that of a man betrayed, but of a manager who had been made a fool. The entire project was based on a material misrepresentation, a lie so profound it had reshaped our species' understanding of the universe. And the real intelligence, the ones who had built these puppets, were still up there. The data from the somatic probe was a blade that severed the mission's primary artery. All previous assumptions were now liabilities. Every report filed, every analysis offered by Finch, was now an exercise in fiction. I began to type, composing the message for the board. The language had to be precise, stripped of emotion, grounded in the unassailable logic of risk assessment. To the ISC Board of Directors, this is Orson Hayes, Executive Director of Off-World Assets, Habitat Prime. Subject: urgent, mission reclassification, Project Pantomime. Summary: previous assessments of the Xyos entity are now nullified. New data confirms the asset is a non-biological unmanned surveillance platform. The presence of a controlling hostile intelligence is confirmed. Mission status is now red. First contact is a failure. We are compromised. I attached the probe's analysis log and the video of the asset degradation event. Then I began outlining the required operational shift. All surface teams recalled. A full quarantine of all materials returned from Xyos. A defensive posture for Habitat Prime. The door chimed. I glanced up. It was Dr. Bell, the ethicist. His face, often arranged into a scholar's mild disapproval, was now chalk white. He carried a data slate clutched to his chest like a shield. "Director," he began, "I have reviewed the preliminary data from Dr. Croft's probe. The implications are that we have been operating under a flawed premise," I said, not pausing my typing. "The new premise is that we are under observation by an unknown technological entity with unknown capabilities and motives." "But its ontological status, what is it we have been interacting with?" He stepped closer, his knuckles white where they gripped the slate. "Are they slaves, or simply extensions of a single being like a hand is to a body? The ethical framework for this scenario is non-existent. Any action we take now is without precedent." He was a system caught in a recursive loop. The man hired to prevent moral catastrophe was now generating a denial-of-service attack on decisive action. "Dr. Bell, your function is to assess the ethical risk. The primary risk has shifted from cultural contamination to technological infiltration. I suggest you focus your analysis on that." As he stood there wrestling with the phantom ethics of a machine, I saw it again, a subtle tick. He raised his free hand to adjust his spectacles, a common gesture for him. But then his thumb and forefinger pinched the bridge of his nose. His eyes squeezed shut for a long second. It was an expression of pure, bone-deep weariness, and it was a perfect copy of a gesture I had seen Vance make in private moments of stress when he thought no one was watching. The two men could not be more different, the soldier and the scholar. Yet there it was, another piece of code running on the wrong hardware. My diagnostic on CENTCOM had confirmed the system was clean. The data was not being corrupted. The data was reflecting a real event, a contagion, not of the flesh, but of the self. I finished the report. I read it over twice, deleting a single adjective, deceptive, as it implied an emotional judgment. The facts were sufficient. I hit send. A small icon appeared on my husk's display, a timer counting down from 18 minutes. The time it would take for my words to cross the void and arrive at Earth. Then another 18 minutes for their reply to make the journey back. For the next 36 minutes, I was functionally alone. The sole authority in a theatre of operations whose true nature I was only just beginning to grasp. I stood up, the chair groaning under my weight. "Dr. Bell," I said, my voice harder now. "Assemble all department heads in the briefing room in 15 minutes. His eyes widened slightly. "All of them? What should I tell them is the subject?" I picked up the husk. "Tell them the project has experienced a scope creep, and we are now recalculating the cost." The briefing room was a functional space, dominated by a large composite table. Its walls were the same unpainted, textured concrete as the rest of Habitat Prime. The department heads filed in with tight jaws and darting eyes, like people expecting to be blamed for something they didn't understand. Dr. Finch was there, the life drained from his face, like a prophet forced to kneel before a failed prophecy. Vance stood by the door, a solid, unmoving presence. Silas Croft, the biologist, looked exhausted but focused. Dr. Bell hovered near his chair, shuffling data slates. I docked my husk at the head of the table, its main screen projecting onto the wall behind me. The image I chose was the materials analysis from the somatic probe, a simple, stark list of non-biological components. "As of 2100 hours station time," I began, my voice clear and amplified by the room's acoustics. "Project Pantomime is terminated. The operational directive has been reclassified. Our previous mission of diplomatic contact is now a mission of threat assessment and containment." A low murmur went through the room. I let it ripple and die out. "The beings we have designated pantomimes are not living organisms," I continued, gesturing to the screen. "They are sophisticated, non-biological constructs. In essence, they are remotely operated drones. We do not know their full capabilities, their range, or the nature of the intelligence controlling them from orbit. Therefore, we will now operate under the assumption that this intelligence is hostile." I laid out the new protocols. A complete recall of all surface personnel and equipment, effective immediately. The establishment of a full quarantine on the shuttle bay and all related labs. A station-wide diagnostic of all communication systems to search for unauthorized signals. "Our posture is now defensive," I concluded. "All contact with the constructs will cease. We will observe, we will analyze, and we will prepare." Finch, who had been staring blankly at the table, finally looked up. His voice was fragile. You can't know they're hostile, Orson. They've done nothing to harm us. They have engaged in a systematic campaign of deception from the moment we arrived," I countered. "That is a hostile act. They have misrepresented their nature to gain access to our personnel and procedures. That is espionage. Or perhaps it is their way of communicating." Finch's voice gained a sliver of its old fervor. "Perhaps this is how they bridge the gap, by showing us a reflection of ourselves first, a shared ground upon which to build." As he spoke, he clasped his hands together on the table, his fingers interlaced tightly, a gesture of desperate sincerity. Across the table, Tobin Shaw, the young hydroponics tech who had witnessed the asset degradation, unconsciously mirrored the exact gesture. Her hands formed the same tight knot on the table in front of her. She wasn't looking at Finch. Her gaze was distant, unfocused. My eyes flicked between them. Another data point. The contagion was spreading. The synchronization was no longer just a phantom in the biometric logs. It was visible here in this room. A behavioral virus transmitted by line of sight. "The time for philosophical debate is over, Dr. Finch," I said, my voice cutting him off. "This is now a security operation." Suddenly, Kalen Vance spoke from the doorway. "Director, I think Finch might have a point." Every head in the room turned to him. My own focus narrowed. It was a statement so contrary to Vance's established character profile that it registered as a system error. Vance, the ultimate pragmatist, siding with Finch, the ultimate idealist. Vance approached. "We don't know their motives. Treating them as hostile could provoke a response we aren't prepared for. Maybe a cautious, non-aggressive stance is the best security." His words were Finch's argument, but the voice was Vance's. As he spoke, his shoulders had a slight slump, a posture of academic uncertainty that belonged to Dr. Bell. The man was a collage of other people's mannerisms, a walking, talking symptom of the infection. The crew wasn't just mirroring each other, they were becoming each other. A homogenization, a flattening of the psychological landscape, and it was making them useless. Before I could respond, an alert flashed on my husk, overriding the personnel displays. The signal was a stark red banner. "Priority 1, unidentified mass detected. High orbit, no transponder." A ripple of tension went through the room. Every eye snapped from Vance to me. High orbit was supposed to be empty except for us and the rubble of the system's formation. "Source?" I commanded, already bringing the long-range sensor array to full power. "No known source, Director," Vance said, the security man in him instantly reasserting control. "It wasn't there on the last sweep." "Route optical telemetry to the main display," I ordered. "Magnification at maximum." The materials analysis on the wall vanished, replaced by the black of space, dotted with the hard, sharp points of distant stars. CENTCOM's targeting software acquired the object and the view zoomed, the image clarifying as multiple sensor inputs converged. It was not a ship, not in any conventional sense. It was a dark, asymmetrical mass, kilometers long, like a piece of dead coral scaled to the size of a city block. Its surface was a chaotic patchwork of bruised, non-reflective plating, crystalline growths, and what looked like scarred, fibrous bone. There were no lights, no visible weapon ports, no viewports. It was a dead thing that moved, a corpse floating in the dark. This was the source, the puppet master. As we watched, mesmerized, a tiny piece of it broke away, a fleck of darkness detaching from the larger shadow. It was small, no bigger than a cargo sled. It began to move, its trajectory a slow burn. It was not aimed at us. I tracked its vector on the husk, my own systems cross-referencing its projected path with station schematics. The line of its travel was clean, direct, and unambiguous. "Its target," I said, the words feeling like ice in my throat, "is the Ansible relay. Our connection to Earth. The single buoy floating 1,000 kilometers away that allowed us to speak to home." Dr. Bell, the ethicist, was staring at the screen, his face ashen. He looked small, lost. He spoke in a voice that was barely audible, a ghost of a thought given sound. "They were never interested in us," he whispered. "Just what we were, what we could do, how we would react." He shook his head slowly. "They're not explorers, they're appraisers. They've finished the inspection, and now they're severing our line to the landlord before they move in." He looked around at the silent room, at the faces of the crew. "They're here to take it all. We're just the prior tenants. They're the inheritors." The name hung in the air, a piece of impromptu, fearful poetry. It was a useless, sentimental designation. I would log the entity as hostile alpha, but I knew the crew would call them the Inheritors. It was a name that fit the cold dread expanding in the room. The probe on the screen continued its burn. They were not screaming threats or firing weapons. They were performing a tactical amputation, isolating the limb before the system could realize it was under attack. They had finished gathering their data. "CENTCOM," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Project intercept solutions for the inbound object. Use any available asset." The baritone voice of the station's AI responded instantly. "Calculating. No station-based assets are capable of intercepting the target before impact. The object's velocity is too high. The Ansible relay is outside the effective range of our point defense systems." Futility. A clean, calculated fact. I looked at the main screen. The probe was a dark speck growing steadily larger against the starfield. Time to impact. 4 minutes, 27 seconds. Around the table, the discipline of my command staff was degrading into its component parts. Dr. Finch was shaking his head slowly, muttering, "A misunderstanding. It must be a misunderstanding." His denial was a system trying to reboot from a fatal error. Tobin Shaw, the hydroponics tech, let out a small, choked sound. She put a hand to her mouth, her fingers splayed wide in a gesture of pure shock. A moment later, Dr. Croft, 2 seats down, mirrored the exact gesture, his own hand rising to cover his mouth. They were not looking at each other. They were just nodes in a circuit, sharing the same surge of panic. "Can't we fire on the main ship?" a junior engineer asked. "Make them back off." "Negative," Vance said, his security training momentarily overriding the behavioral contagion. "We don't know its defensive capabilities. An unprovoked attack on a superior force is a terminal strategic error." But as he finished, his free hand began to drum a frantic, irregular rhythm on his thigh, an anxious tick that belonged to the engineer who had just spoken. The room had become a relay of reflexes, one fear copied, amplified, transmitted. My own jaw was a block of solid ice. I consciously forced the muscles to unlock. Operational efficiency had to be maintained, starting with my own. I turned my attention back to the screen. The Ansible relay was visible now, a slender, cross-beamed structure of silver and gold foil, a fragile piece of human ingenuity hanging in the void. The probe closed the distance with relentless, silent speed. There was no flash, no grand explosion. The probe simply merged with the relay. For a fraction of a second, the structure seemed to warp around the point of impact, like metal turning to liquid. Then it came apart, not in a fiery burst, but in a silent, expanding cloud of glittering dust and tumbling fragments. The camera feed held for another second on the ruin of our only connection to home. Then the screen went dead. A single, stark message appeared in its place, written in the default font of the consortium's operating system. Signal lost. The silence in the briefing room was absolute. The crew looked at me, mouths parted, eyes glassy. A room full of question marks shaped like people. They were broken assets waiting for a new directive. I would provide it. "Dr. Bell, you will go to the medbay and prepare sedation protocols. Any crew member, regardless of rank, who is unable to maintain operational composure will be sedated and confined to quarters. This is a matter of mission security." I turned to Vance. "Kalen, you will take your team and initiate a full station lockdown. No one moves between modules without my direct authorization. Recall the last surface shuttle. We are sealing the box." My eyes swept across the rest of them. "The rest of you, return to your posts. Run full diagnostics on your systems. I want a complete inventory of our power reserves, our water supplies, our nutritional assets, and every round of ammunition on this station. We are no longer a science mission. We are a garrison under siege. Act accordingly." The station fell silent in stages. First came the percussive clatter of maglocks engaging on bulkhead doors, a series of sharp reports echoing down the long corridors as Vance's security team sealed the station module by module. Next, the low hum of non-essential systems faded as I rerouted power to prioritize life support and defensive arrays. Finally, the human noise ceased. My world contracted to the glow of the husk's displays. The bio-leasing dashboard was a field of yellow. Cortisol levels were elevated across all personnel. Sleep cycle disruptions were rampant. A system of 111 human assets operating under extreme stress. Only my own icon remained a steady, placid green. My internal state was an irrelevant variable. My function was to manage the crisis. The inventory audit painted a grim picture. We had nutritional paste and supplemental hydroponic growth to last 300 days. Water recyclers were operating at 98% efficiency, but that still represented a net loss. We had 82 days before rationing became critical. Oxygen was a closed loop, stable for now. Ammunition was a finite resource, 144 M7 kinetic driver rounds total. The M7 is a ballistic tool, a magnetically accelerated nail gun that fires tungsten rods, designed for hull breaches, not combat. A crude but effective weapon against the puppets, useless against the ship that now hung in orbit above us. The ship I had designated Hostile Alpha. I was running a simulation, calculating the station's structural stress tolerances for a sudden course correction, when a new alert chimed. It was an internal comms request, a priority-flagged message from Dr. Finch. He was requesting a meeting, in person. Denying the request would mark me as a tyrant and could seed dissent. Granting it was a calculated risk, an exposure to his particular brand of emotional contagion. I chose the latter. An understood risk is a manageable one. "Send him to my command center," I messaged Vance. "He will come alone." 5 minutes later, the door opened, and Finch entered. The man who walked in looked flayed down to function. All presence gone, just process in a human shape. The fire of his conviction was gone, leaving behind only the ash. His lab coat was rumpled, his face was pale, and his eyes had the unfocused glaze of someone running a constant, draining subroutine of grief in their own mind. He did not speak at first, just stood before my desk. I did not offer him a seat. "I have analyzed the data, Orson," he finally said. "The mimicry, the timing of the Ansible destruction. I was wrong. Not about the empathy, but about the context." I waited. His new theory would be a work of art, a masterpiece of rationalization, designed to protect the core of his belief system. "This isn't an invasion," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "It's a crucible. They've isolated us. They've severed our connection to everything we know to see what we become in the vacuum. To force a more authentic interaction. To see if our empathy survives when hope is removed." It was exactly what I expected. He was reframing the hostile act as a benevolent test. "Your hypothesis is noted, Doctor. Is there a point?" "Yes." He straightened, and for a moment, a flicker of the old persuasive energy returned. "The last shuttle is still docked, the one that retrieved the surface team. It is prepped and fueled. I need to take it back down." The sheer irrationality of the request was stunning. A cost-benefit analysis of his proposal resulted in a 100% chance of asset loss for a 0% chance of success. "Your request is denied." "You don't understand," he pleaded. "They left one of the constructs behind, near the landing zone. It's just waiting. If I can go down there, alone, without the noise of the teams, without the security protocols. If I can just show it that we aren't afraid, that we still choose connection." His logic was a catastrophic failure. His hope was a liquidated asset. But as he spoke, my attention was snared by a detail. A small, repetitive motion. His right thumb was rubbing against the side of his index finger. A specific circular gesture. A nervous tick. I had the entire crew's behavioral profiles archived in the husk. That tick was not his. I keyed in a search string. The system cross-referenced the gesture from the visual feed against the personnel archive. The result appeared a second later. The tick belonged to a man named Marcus Elgin, the lead communications engineer for the Ansible relay. A man Finch had spoken to on perhaps 3 occasions. A man who was now a cloud of frozen particles, 1,000 kilometers away. The contagion wasn't just spreading behaviors between the living. It was pulling from a deeper well. It was replaying the ghosts of the dead. They hadn't just watched us. They had downloaded us. I looked at Finch, at his desperate, pleading eyes, and saw a tool being wielded. He wasn't just a broken man clinging to a failed idea. He was a vector. The enemy was using his hope against us. I found Finch's file on the bio-leasing dashboard. His icon was already red. "Dr. Finch, you will be escorted to the med bay. You will be sedated and placed in medical quarantine." His face fell. "Orson, no, you can't. This is our only chance." "You are a security risk, Doctor," I interrupted. "And from this moment on, you are to be considered a potential hostile vector. Your belief isn't just a liability anymore. It's a weapon being aimed at this station." A beat passed. Finch stared at me, his expression slack with incomprehension. The threat had not registered, only the finality of the command. The door to the command center opened again. Vance stepped inside, flanked by a security officer. Finch saw them, and a tremor went through his body, a last desperate surge of his original self. "Orson, listen to me. This isn't a security problem. It's a crisis of faith. We have to show them." His words trailed off as Vance placed a hand on his shoulder. The touch was not violent, but it was an undeniable endpoint to the conversation. Finch's shoulders slumped. He did not resist as they turned him toward the door. As he was led out, his eyes found mine one last time. They were not angry. They were filled with a profound, bottomless pity. He saw me as a man making a terrible mistake, blind to the salvation he was offering. The door closed, leaving me alone in the sudden quiet. I had just quarantined the mission's lead psychologist based on a borrowed nervous tic. I had declared a man a hostile vector because he refused to surrender his hope. The decision was logical. The data supported it. But it felt like jettisoning a critical component from a machine I did not fully understand. My hand moved to key in the official report when the door chimed again. Dr. Bell stood in the entryway, his data slate held tight against his chest. His face, which was usually pale, had no color at all. "Director, I must formally object to the quarantine of Dr. Finch. It is a gross violation of the consortium's own charter on crew welfare. He has committed no crime. He is not ill." "He is a variable I cannot control," I replied. "He presents an unacceptable risk to the station's operational security." "The risk of what?" "Believing too much." Bell stepped forward, his voice gaining strength. "Director, I was the chief ethicist on the Tanager project. I know you've read the file." I had. The Tanager incident was a corporate-funded psychological study on long-term isolation that had ended in disaster. Bell's protocols, designed to protect the subjects through non-intervention, had instead created the perfect environment for a charismatic sociopath to psychologically torture the other participants. Bell had watched his own ideals become a cage. The failure had defined his career. "In my final report for Tanager," he said, his voice dropping, "I wrote that the core failure was not the protocol. It was the decision to treat a human being as a predictable system. It was the willingness to sacrifice one person's well-being for the perceived integrity of the experiment. That is the mistake you are making now. You are sealing a man away because his data doesn't fit your model." He was pleading. His entire body was a signal of distress. But my own systems were registering his argument as a procedural complaint, a request to revert to a failed operational model. "Your comparison is flawed, Doctor," I said. "The Tanager project was contained. This is not. The contagion I am tracking is real." I swiped a hand across my husk, sending a file to the main display on the wall. A split screen appeared. On one side was the video of Vance gesturing like Finch. On the other, footage of Dr. Croft covering his mouth in perfect sync with Tobin Shaw. I added another file. the biometric data showing the sleep cycle sync between Bell and Shaw. This is not a matter of belief. It is a pattern, a transmissible phenomenon that is eroding the command integrity of this station. It is a weapon, and Finch's psychology makes him uniquely vulnerable to it, and therefore uniquely useful to the enemy. My decision is not a punishment. It is a necessary resource reallocation. I am moving a compromised asset out of the operational theatre. Bell stared at the screen. He saw the proof. He saw his own biometric data, his own private rhythms laid bare and tangled with another's. He saw the twitching ghosts of his colleagues' mannerisms. He had no counter-argument. The data was absolute. He slowly lowered his head. He looked defeated. But when he looked back up, his eyes were clear. The trembling was gone. "Then you leave me no choice," he said quietly. "As mission ethicist, my mandate is to protect the crew from catastrophic moral failure, and I assess that your current course of action represents exactly that. I cannot stop you, Director, but I will not be complicit. I will document everything. And if any of us survive this, the record will show that this was the moment we chose to become the monsters we were afraid of." He turned and walked out of my command center, his back straight. He had found a new purpose. He was no longer a participant in the mission. He was its future prosecutor. I was now on trial, and the only other witness was a silent, hostile intelligence watching from the darkness. For the next several hours, my focus was absolute. I managed the station as a closed system approaching critical failure. I optimized power distribution, shutting down entire modules to create a fortified central core. I reran the inventory audits, calculating our operational lifespan down to the hour. The crew, confined to their designated areas, became abstract data points, their biometric feeds a constant jittery waveform of elevated stress. The behavioral contagion continued its spread. On the security feeds, I saw 2 engineers in different sectors begin to pace their rooms in perfect, mirrored synchrony. I logged it, another line item in a growing list of systemic corruptions. The ship of the Inheritors, Hostile Alpha, remained in high orbit, a dead mass on the sensor arrays. It made no move. It sent no signals. It simply waited. Its silence was a far more effective weapon than any overt threat. It was an engine of paranoia, forcing us to imagine the horrors it had planned. My own body was a machine I pushed to its limits. I bypassed 2 sleep cycles, substituting nutrient paste and stimulants for rest. It was during the 3rd simulated day cycle of the lockdown that the pattern changed. An alert pinged on my husk. It was not a station alarm. It was a proximity alert from the surface of Xyos. I tapped the command, routing the sensor feed to my screen. It was a live feed from a perimeter camera near the landing zone, one of the few pieces of external hardware I had left active. In the center of the frame, bathed in the ambient light of the gas giant in Xylos' sky, stood a single pantomime. It was the one Finch had wanted to return for, the one left behind. It was standing perfectly still, its blank head aimed directly at the camera lens. It had been standing in that exact spot, unmoving, for 72 hours. A sentinel at an empty outpost. As I watched, it moved. It raised one of its arms. It did not mimic anything. There was no one on the surface to copy. This was an original gesture. Its hand opened, fingers extended in what a human would interpret as a wave. A greeting. My own hand froze over the husk's interface. This was new data. A fundamental shift. The pantomime held the gesture for a full minute. Then its hand closed into a fist. Slowly, it raised its middle finger. The gesture was universal, obscene, a symbol of pure, unadulterated contempt. It was a piece of human culture so base, so common, that it had likely been scraped from a dozen different minds on the station, and it was aimed directly at us. The construct held the gesture, a statue of silent mockery. Then it did something else. It brought its other hand up and pointed. Not at the sky, not at the camera. It pointed at the ground at its feet. A low, vibrating hum came through the camera's audio pickup. The rust-colored soil around the pantomime began to stir, as if agitated from beneath. The ground swelled, cracking open. It was not an earthquake, it was a growth. It rose from the ground, tapering to a sharp point, growing with the slow menace of something that didn't care to rush. Then another broke the surface beside it, and another. Within minutes, the entire landing zone, the area we had called the Calm, was a forest of these stark white spikes. They weren't just spikes. I ran a pattern recognition algorithm on the visual data. The result was immediate and chilling. The placement of the spires was not random. They formed a pattern, a three-dimensional star chart, our star chart. In the center of the pattern was a single larger spire representing our sun. Other spires represented familiar neighboring stars, and there, at the edge of the pattern, was a representation of the gas giant this station orbited. The model was a perfect, two-scale replica of our corner of the galaxy. The pantomime lowered its arm. It turned its blank head and looked at the single larger spire at the center of the display, the one that represented our home. The spire began to dissolve. It did not crumble or fall, it simply slurred, melting into a puddle of its base components and sinking back into the ground, leaving an empty space in the heart of their celestial map. The message was clear. It bypassed language, ethics, and hope. It was a statement of intent, delivered with the irrefutable clarity of a project plan. They weren't just taking the station. They were updating their territorial maps. And our home system had just been marked for deletion. For a long moment, I did not move. My mind, a machine built for contingency planning, was cycling through scenarios at a rate that felt like standing still. All of them terminated in failure. We had no weapon that could challenge hostile Alpha. We had no way to warn Earth. Every action available to me was a rounding error in their final calculation. The clarity that had sustained me for 3 days began to fracture. A new sensation bloomed in my chest, a hot, tight pressure I had not logged since the day I watched 42 life signs extinguish on a monitor. It was the physical manifestation of absolute impotence. I looked at my hand, resting on the husk. It was trembling. Not a violent shake, but a fine, high-frequency tremor. The system was showing signs of stress. My system. I balled the hand into a fist, the pressure of my nails digging into my palm a welcome concrete sensation. The shaking stopped. Control reasserted. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Not a strategic recall, but a sliver of data from a corrupted file I thought long archived. My daughter Chloe, at 7 years old. We were at a corporate retreat, a manicured park with a small lake. She had built a complex structure of twigs and leaves on the shore, a small, fragile castle. A swan, a creature of stupid, aggressive elegance, had come ashore and dismantled it, piece by piece, not out of malice, but out of a placid indifference. It was simply clearing its path. Chloe had not cried. She had just watched, lips pressed thin, eyes wide, the quiet fury of someone watching meaning unravel in real time. The memory was a non sequitur, a useless piece of emotional data. I scrubbed it from my active thoughts. I brought up the station's internal schematics on the husk. If direct confrontation was a non-viable path, then the only remaining option was indirect action. I began running a new series of simulations, pushing the station's systems beyond their intended limits. What was the maximum stress the station's fusion core could take before a containment failure? What was the projected blast radius? Could Habitat Prime be turned from a prison into a weapon? A very small, very crude weapon, but a weapon nonetheless. The initial results were not promising. Even a full core detonation at our current orbit would be a firefly trying to blind a mountain. The energy discharge would be negligible against a vessel the size of hostile Alpha. A costly, pointless act of self-destruction. I kept running the calculations, There had to be a variable I was missing, a way to leverage our single remaining asset, this station, to a more profitable outcome. As I worked, a notification blinked in the corner of my screen. It was an automated alert from the personnel archives. The system was flagging a corrupted data file. The file was a personal voice message, a non-mission critical piece of data. The sender ID was listed. Hayes, Chloe. It was from before the Ansible was destroyed. A message from my daughter, one I had never opened. In the triage of the unfolding crisis, my own family had been deemed a low-priority item. I had not spoken to her in 6 months. Our communication was a series of failed data transfers, conversations where her emotional requirements exceeded my available output. She was the one project of my life that was a complete, irretrievable loss. My hand moved, a motion independent of conscious thought. I tapped the file. Her voice, distorted by the compression algorithm and the vast distance it had traveled, filled the quiet of the command center. "Dad, it's me. I know you're busy, but people here are starting to talk about the mission. They're saying something went wrong, that you've gone dark. Is it true? Are you okay?" There was a pause, a sound of a breath being taken. Just send something so I know." The message ended. The file closed. 7 billion abstract liabilities on a planet marked for deletion had just been given a name, an asset, a single, priceless asset I had to protect. The hot pressure in my chest intensified. The tremor returned to my hand, stronger this time. I looked at the simulation of the station's core detonation, a futile gesture of defiance. I looked at the live feed from Xyos, at the obscene star chart with the hole where my daughter lived. I looked at my shaking hand. It was the same tremor I had seen in Dr. Finch. A shared symptom. The contagion had found me. The fear was not mine. It was borrowed from the panicked crew, from the terror I saw in the eyes of my subordinates. No, that was a lie, a convenient, analytical explanation for a simple truth. The fear was mine. For the first time since Hyperion, I was registering it not as a biological indicator, but as an emotion. The observer was finally and completely the subject. I closed my eyes, and in the darkness behind them I saw the missing variable. The way to turn the station into a viable weapon. Not by making the explosion bigger, but by making the target more vulnerable. The Inheritors had one weakness. It was the same weakness that had crippled my crew. They were masters of biological systems. Their ship was not a machine, it was a life form, and all life can be infected. Xylos itself was the key. Its atmosphere was filled with rust-colored spores from the resonant flora. Harmless to us, but a plague to sensitive electronics. What would they do to a ship that was fundamentally a piece of biological hardware? We had to get those spores to high orbit. There was only one way to do that. A controlled detonation of Habitat Prime's core, not in orbit, but in the upper atmosphere of Xylos. The explosion would be a delivery system, aerosolizing trillions of tons of planetary dust and spores, creating a cloud of biological poison that would envelop the Inheritor ship. It would be a slow, agonizing death for their vessel. A system-wide infection they could not scrub. It was a monstrous plan. It required me to pilot the station, my home, and the tomb of my crew on a suicide course into the planet. It was a resource reallocation on an unimaginable scale. It was the only move left on the ledger that didn't end in total bankruptcy. The plan settled into my mind, not as a hope, but as a sequence of procedural steps. A project plan for a controlled demolition. My shaking hand stilled. The fear did not vanish. It was compressed, stored, relegated to a non-essential background process. My function was restored. I brought up the station's propulsion schematics on the husk. Habitat Prime was not designed for atmospheric entry. It was a creature of the void, a fragile web of modules and skeletal supports. Piloting it would be like trying to fly a cathedral. A single miscalculation in the burn sequence would tear the station apart long before it reached the optimal detonation altitude. The command to initiate such a maneuver could not be executed from my station alone. A deorbit burn required a two-part authorization, my command code and a physical override from the station's engineering core. A safety protocol to prevent a single, compromised director from turning the station into a kinetic weapon, a protocol I now had to circumvent. There was only one man with the access and the knowledge to help me. A man whose icon on the bio-leasing dashboard was a steady, predictable yellow. Silas Croft, the exobiologist, a scientist but a pragmatist, a man who followed data, not faith. I routed a secure comms link to his lab in the quarantine wing. "Dr. Croft, I require your assistance." His face appeared on a small screen on my husk. He looked haggard, but his eyes were clear. "Director, what do you need?" I did not waste time with preamble. "I have developed a plan to neutralize hostile Alpha. It requires piloting the station into the upper atmosphere of Xyos and initiating a full core detonation." Croft's expression did not change. He did not recoil in horror or argue the morality of the act. He processed the information. "The station will not survive atmospheric entry," he stated. It was a simple fact, not an objection. "Correct," I said. "Survival of the asset is not the objective. The objective is to use the explosion to create a wide-spectrum spore bloom in high orbit. Your own research noted the spore's disruptive effect on complex electronics. My hypothesis is that they will be catastrophically effective against the biological technology of the inheritor vessel." He was silent for a full 10 seconds, his mind running the calculations. I could see the logic connecting behind his eyes. "It's a viable theory," he finally conceded. "The spore's resonant frequency could cascade through their biosystems like a feedback loop, a planetary-scale EMP tailored to their biology. But the override, it requires a chief engineer's command sequence." "The chief engineer is currently sedated and confined to the medbay," I said. "His operational effectiveness has been compromised by the contagion. I need you to bypass the manual lock at the engineering console. That's beyond my authorization. It would require dismantling the security housing on the primary control conduit." "Yes," I said. "I am authorizing you to do so. Consider it a necessary retasking of your skill set." Another silence. This one was different. It was the space in which a man weighs his professional obligations against an order that will certainly kill him and everyone he knows. "Why me, Director?" Croft asked quietly. "Because you are the only other person on this station who has fully accepted the data. You do not see the Inheritors as a spiritual test or an ethical dilemma. You see them as they are, a hostile biological system. And you understand that the only way to fight a hostile system is to introduce a catastrophic error. I am asking you to help me execute that error." He looked away from the camera, at something in his lab. When his gaze returned, the last flicker of doubt was gone. "I'll need a kinetic driver and a plasma torch. The housing on that console is hardened." "They are authorized," I said. "Proceed to the engineering core. I will meet you there. Maintain comm silence." I cut the feed. The first step was taken. The next was to move from my command center, my fortress of data. I undocked the husk and walked through the door. The heavy, reinforced door to the engineering sector stood before me. I placed my palm on the sensor and the locks disengaged. Across the room, Silas Croft knelt before a control console, the one that housed the physical override for the station's propulsion. A plasma torch lay on the deck beside him, its tip still glowing a faint orange. He was using an M7 kinetic driver, the security sidearm as a tool, using its magnetic pulse to hammer at the hardened bolts on the console's access panel. Each pulse was a sharp, percussive crack, a sound of rules being broken by force. He did not look up as I entered. He was a man with a task, his focus absolute. He was the perfect and final asset for the job. "Report," I said, my voice cutting through the noise of his work. The housing is tougher than the schematics indicated, Croft said without pausing. He lined up the driver for another strike. The bolts are maglocked from the inside. I have to shear them off. Another 5 minutes. We don't have 5 minutes, I said, setting the husk down on a nearby console. I brought up the external sensor feed. The massive dead form of the inheritor ship hung in the black, patient and still. Their lack of action is an action. They are waiting for something. We cannot let them dictate the timeline. Croft stopped. He looked at the driver in his hands, then at the half-sheared bolt. The torch will melt the lock, but it risks slagging the manual conduit behind the plate. If that happens, we lose control entirely. We become a dead stick in orbit. What is the probability of conduit damage? High, he said. 70, maybe 80%. An unacceptable risk. My plan required precision. A dead stick was a useless weapon. My eyes swept the engineering bay. Conduits, diagnostic ports, and there, mounted on the far bulkhead, was a row of red canisters. Aegis foam emergency sealant. Designed to seal catastrophic hull breaches by spraying 2 chemicals that mixed and hardened into an impenetrable resin. It was a tool of irreversible choice, but the canisters themselves were pressurized to an extreme degree. Croft, I said, a new calculation forming, a desperate, ugly piece of battlefield engineering. The driver, give it to me. He looked at me, then handed the heavy tool over. It felt solid, real, in my hands. Get back, I told him, behind the main reactor shielding. I walked over to the bank of Aegis foam canisters. I selected one. The chemical agent inside was designed to expand exponentially. I raised the kinetic driver and aimed it at the canister's primary valve. It was not a precision target. A ruptured canister would detonate with the force of a small bomb. It was a crude solution. An act of brutal, simple physics. An unmanaged, explosive variable. Director, what are you... Croft started. This is not a debate, Doctor, I said, my finger on the driver's actuator. It's a necessary resource reallocation. I did not wait for Croft's protest to finish. I pulled the actuator. The kinetic driver gave its sharp, percussive crack. The tungsten rod crossed the 10 meters in a fraction of a second and punched through the canister's valve casing. The result was not a fire, but a physical concussion. A contained hurricane of pressure unleashed in an instant. The air in the engineering bay buckled. A deep, gut-punching whoomp slammed into me, throwing me back against a support strut. The husk skidded across the deck. Shrapnel, fragments of the red canister and its mounting, screamed through the air. I pushed myself up, my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. A fine, amber-colored dust. The unmixed resin agent coated every surface, filling the air with a dry, chemical scent. Across the room, the control console was a wreck. The explosion had torn the armored plate clean off its hinges, leaving it dangling by a single, sparking conduit. The delicate manual override panel behind it was exposed, miraculously intact but flickering erratically. Croft emerged from behind the reactor shield. He looked from the destroyed canister to the smoking console. It worked. The plan was insane, but it worked. A calculated risk, I said, retrieving the husk. Its casing was scarred, but the screen was still lit. Now get us control. Croft scrambled to the panel, pulling a diagnostic tool from his kit. He plugged it into a port, his hands moving with a surgeon's haste. The main conduit is overloaded. I need to bypass the security handshake. It will take a minute. You have 30 seconds, I said, bringing the propulsion controls online on my husk. The station's trajectory plotter appeared on the screen, a clean arc from our current orbit to a designated point in Xylos' upper atmosphere. The plan was logged. All it needed was the 2-part authorization. Croft, now. Bypass engaged, he said, his hand hovering over a physical switch now exposed on the console. The board is green, ready for your command sequence. This was the final moment. The decision point from which there was no return. I looked at the screen of the husk. at the clean line representing the murder of 110 people and the potential salvation of 7 billion. "Authorizing on my mark," I said. 3, 2, 1, mark. I entered my command code. "Engage," Croft said, and flipped the switch. A deep, bone-jarring vibration shuddered through the entire station. A low groan of stressed metal, like a giant awakening from a long sleep, swelled into a deafening roar. The main thrusters had ignited. The floor beneath my feet tilted as Habitat Prime, my fortress, my prison, began its final, fatal descent. The bioleasing dashboard was a solid wall of red, 110 human systems registering the sudden, violent lurch into oblivion. Their panic was a silent, frantic storm of data I no longer needed to manage. I switched to the external sensors. On the edge of the screen there was movement from hostile Alpha. The ship was reacting. Dozens of small, dark flecks detached from its surface. Probes, the same kind that had destroyed our Ansible. They were not firing on us. They were moving ahead, accelerating, racing to position themselves along our descent path. They were not trying to destroy us. They were trying to build a wall, to stop us before we reached the atmosphere. The station screamed around us. The vibration was no longer just in the deck plating. It was in my bones, in the fluid of my eyes. The external camera showed the probes of the Inheritors forming a crude net between us and the planet, their intent clear. They were not trying to obliterate us, but to slow us, to deflect our trajectory just enough to miss the atmosphere. A clean, efficient interception. "They're boxing us in," Croft said over the roar of the engines. "Our thrusters don't have the power for evasive maneuvers. We're locked on this course." He was right. I watched the projected trajectories on the husk. The probes would reach their intercept point 16 seconds before we reached the atmospheric threshold. The margin of our failure was razor-thin, but absolute. They had outcalculated us. My hand tightened on the husk. All this, the plan, the sacrifice, for nothing. To fail at the final moment. I had written off every asset, and the final column still refused to balance. I saw one last desperate variable, a single, unused asset. I looked at Croft. His face was slick with sweat. "Croft, the shuttle, the one docked in Bay 3, is it still functional?" His eyes widened. "Yes, but there's no time. We'd be torn apart before we even cleared the bay doors." "I'm not trying to escape," I said. "I'm creating a diversion." I found the shuttle's flight control systems, accessed the pre-flight diagnostics, and overrode the safety protocols. The shuttle was a small, agile vessel. I programmed its nav computer with a single, insane directive, a full-power corkscrew burn directly toward the center of the approaching probe wall. It was not a weapon. It was a piece of chaos thrown into a perfect system. "I've opened the bay doors," I told Croft. "I need you to launch it." He didn't question me. He just nodded, his fingers finding the right subroutine on the engineering console. Launching. On the external camera, the shuttle shot out of its bay like a fleck of metal flicked from a giant's thumb. It spun wildly, its engines flaring, a piece of unpredictable shrapnel aimed at the heart of their defense. The Inheritor probes reacted instantly. Their perfect formation broke. Several of them altered course, their logic compelled to neutralize the immediate, erratic threat. It was a fatal miscalculation on their part. They had assessed us as a unified, predictable threat. They could not account for an act of pure, pointless desperation. Their wall now had a hole in it, a narrow corridor, but a corridor nonetheless. Our trajectory plotter on the husk updated. The intercept was no longer certain. It was now a probability, 50-50, a coin toss at the edge of the world. The station began to shake violently. The first wisps of Xylos' atmosphere were clawing at us. On the screen, the planet was a vast, swirling canvas of rust and ochre. "Hull integrity at 40% and falling," Croft said. "We're coming apart." The ship groaned, a long, deep tearing sound of a bulkhead giving way. I looked at the screen one last time, past the hull breach warnings and the proximity alerts. I found the corrupted audio file. My daughter's voice. I did not play it. I just looked at the file name, the only piece of data that mattered now. "It's a good plan," Croft said, his voice surprisingly calm in the chaos. He was leaning against the console, a man who had accepted the final line item on his own ledger. "As a biological weapon, it's elegant." I did not respond. I was watching the altitude numbers plummet. We were through the gap. The remaining probes were behind us. Below us, there was only the thickening atmosphere. The first real jolt hit, a physical blow that threw me to the deck. The screech of tortured metal was deafening. The air grew hot, filled with the scent of burning polymers. The station was a meteor, a funeral pyre for 112 souls, a delivery system for a cloud of microscopic spores. On the screen of the husk, a final message appeared, its text sharp and clear against the chaos of failing systems. "Core containment failure imminent. Detonation in 10, 9, 8. I did not feel fear. I felt only the stark satisfaction of a balanced sheet. The project was a total loss, but the primary asset was now protected. The cost was acceptable. The countdown reached 3. I closed my eyes, and in the final, silent second before the light consumed everything, a single, unbidden thought, clear and precise, surfaced from the wreckage of my mind. I hope she knows I was okay. 5 years later, Chloe Hayes sat in a cafe across the street from the consortium's global headquarters. The building was no longer the sleek glass tower she remembered from childhood visits. It had been refortified, its base a solid, windowless block of dark composite, its upper levels bristling with sensor arrays that were not on any public record. The architecture of the entire planet had changed. Humanity had learned to look up, and in doing so had started building walls. The official story of the Xyos event was a masterwork of corporate doublespeak. A tragic, unforeseen system failure on Habitat Prime had resulted in the heroic sacrifice of its director, Orson Hayes, and his entire crew, who prevented a catastrophic reactor breach from destabilizing the system. The alien contact was classified as inconclusive. There was a memorial plaque in the lobby with 112 names on it, her father's at the top. The consortium had sent her a commendation, a generous survivor's pension, and a single, sealed data slate containing his mission file, which she was legally forbidden to open. It sat in a safe in her apartment, a black box containing the ghost of a man she barely knew. Her father's legacy was not love. It was a transaction. He had made a final, brutal calculation, and the world had been the beneficiary. She was living in the profit column of his last terrible ledger. He hadn't saved his daughter. He had secured the primary asset. The knowledge settled in her bones like a permanent chill, a truth she had pieced together from redacted reports, the hushed whispers of ex-consortium employees, and the simple, damning fact that humanity was still here, and the silence from the stars that followed the event was absolute. The world he had saved was a haunted one. The initial terror had faded into a low-grade global paranoia. There were new defense platforms in orbit, their development fast-tracked with a blank check from every government. Children learned the names of constellations not with wonder, but with a kind of clinical vigilance. Hope in the universe had been replaced by risk management. This was the true viral inheritance, his worldview, writ large across the face of civilization. Humanity had survived its first encounter by embracing the calculus of its enemy, and now it could not remember any other way to think. That evening, in her small apartment, Chloe held the single personal effect they had returned to her, a data slate containing a copy of his last unopened message to her. She never listened to it. The silence that had preceded it for her entire life, and the permanent silence that followed it, was message enough. She looked out her window at the night sky, at the stars bracketed by the new, ugly silhouettes of orbital defense grids. The terror of the Inheritors was gone, a mystery that had vanished in a flash of light millions of miles away. But a new dread had taken its place. It was the understanding that her father had not fought the monster. He had simply demonstrated that he was the more efficient one. He had looked at the void and seen only an opponent in a hostile takeover, and he had initiated a scorched earth defense to protect his investment. He had won. She was the proof. But his victory had left a scar on the soul of the world, teaching it that in the silent universe, the only thing that truly matters is the final, brutal accounting. And for the rest of her life, she would have to live in the disquieting peace he had bought, forever staring up at the silence he had made.